Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the NEPBIS Team Training for Schools in the second year of the NEPBIS Academy. I'm Eric Mackey.
And I'm Christine Downs.
And we are your trainings for this online session. The content for this training was developed with the support of the NEPBIS network. So for today's training, we are going to be talking about understanding the function or the whys behind behavior. We'll be talking about how to avoid power struggles with students, and we'll also spend some time assessing classroom practices. Tasks for this training for the teams are to review the functions of behavior activity and to review the FAST guidelines that we'll be talking about in just a moment. Here are some suggested readings and resources related to our agenda today. So the motivation. It's an easy to read article from PBIS apps about the functions of behavior, including a link to an online training on basic FBAs. For more resources on functions of behavior, please consider the mini module on nepbis.org. The Dodging the Power Struggle Trap is an article through Intervention Central around strategies teachers can use when they find themselves in power struggles with students. For more on this topic, please consider watching Avoiding Power Struggles, the mini module on nepbis.org. The Supporting and Responding to Behavior Guide is a resource from pbis.org, and it's a handy resource that pulls together the best practices and strategies to support student behavior within the classroom. It is very interactive, including a self-assessment to help teachers to evaluate their own practices, as well as examples of what each practice looks like within primary and secondary contexts. The Habits of Effective Practice brief addresses the reality that it's often hard to create new personal or professional habits, even when we know that they will benefit us. This brief resource from pbis.org identifies strategies you can use to set yourself up to successfully use best practices in classroom management. You can also watch the companion webinar on the same site. Now, with students returning back to schools live, we're more likely to see the frequency of behavior start to creep up. If you're curious about SWIS or would like to bring the school-wide information system to your school for the coming year, please check out our free online SWIS trainings on our webpage. During our time so far in the Academy, we've discussed these 10 basic getting started steps, such as developing a brief statement of purpose, identifying positive school-wide behavioral expectations, and developing database procedures for monitoring. We want you to take some time to take stock in what you've been able to accomplish so far. If you haven't been able to put all these pieces into practices into place yet, that's fine. You're not expected to have it all at this point, but there should be a plan to eventually put these practices into place. As this year begins to wind down, this is a good time to think about what practices you want to prepare in order to roll them out for the next academic year. When you have an opportunity to meet with your team, spend some time talking about what steps you've gone through so far and what you think should be your next steps. Given the time and demands that you have for the remainder of this year, what can you feasibly accomplish? Now we're going to shift gears a bit and talk more specifically about behavior and the why behind student behavior as well as adult behavior. The better we understand the why behind our behaviors, the better we are at addressing those whys. So here's a fun example from Family Circus. So for those of you who might not be able to see the screen very well, what we see is our toddler sitting there crying, whimpering, and mom kind of noticing. She starts walking away, and our toddler friend drops and starts tantruming. She's gone. He notices this and starts walking towards mom, goes up the stairs. She's putting some clothes away. He enters the room and promptly flops back to the ground and starts tantruming again. What do you think is the why behind the baby's behavior? How about the mom's? What we know based on research focused on behavior is that there are core whys, or what we call functions of behavior, which are to get or to escape something. The child from the Family Circus cartoon may be tantruming in order to obtain social attention from his mom. His mother may be trying to escape the loud sensory stimulation of her baby's crying, or trying to get to her bureau to put away her clothes and be done with her chores for the day. This all ties in with reinforcement. If I want attention and I get attention for tantruming, I'm more likely to tantrum again. If I want to escape classwork and when I act out in class, I'm sent out of the class, I'm more likely to act out again. So we want to consider the why behind a behavior so that we can reduce the chance of us mistakenly reinforcing a behavior that we don't want to see. We can also use that why or that function to encourage behaviors that we do want to see. Here are some examples of where we can go wrong with how we address behaviors, such as, Latanya, you skipped 2 school days, so we're going to suspend you for 2 more. Another example, you want my attention? I'll show you attention. Let's have a walk down to the office and have a little chat with the principal. What went wrong? How might this teacher be improperly considering the why or the function of the behaviors? In the case of Latanya, her behavior appears motivated by escape, and she's being given exactly that, escape. In the second example, it seems that the student's behavior is to get attention, or at least that's the teacher's interpretation. If so, he's going to be given exactly what he wants by walking down to the office with the teacher and spending time with another person, the principal, to talk about it. As we all know, our students learn our responses quickly, so we want to think about our patterns of behavior and how we respond. In order to figure out the function of a student's behavior, we need to observe a student over multiple instances of the behavior. At the beginning of the school year, it's likely a bit of a guessing game, trying to figure out what makes each student tick. Now, at this point of the year, you probably have a better sense of them, right? We want to gather information that helps us to see the patterns of behavior to help us to figure out what the why is behind the behavior. We want to gather the ABCs of behavior, A being antecedent, B being the behavior, C being the consequence. When thinking about the behavior, it's important to consider these ABCs. The antecedent, that's what happens just before a behavior occurs. Then we have the behavior, the actual behavior, what can be seen and heard. Try to be concrete in how you're defining the behavior. Labeling a behavior as disrespectful, inappropriate, or out of control, that's subjective. Specifically identify what the student is doing that could be measured and responded to. Then there's the consequence. Be careful here because this terminology gets a little bit confusing. Consequence doesn't necessarily refer to punishment, as is often the case. Instead, consequence means what happens as a result of the behavior. So say I say something out of turn, say something inappropriate, somebody might start snickering afterwards, or a whole bunch of people start paying attention to me afterwards. That is the consequence of my behavior. To determine the probable function of a behavior, you may need to take a careful look at these ABCs, antecedents, behaviors, and consequences over multiple incidences. Let's take a look at a couple examples. So we have an example of Martha. During teacher lectures, Martha repeatedly and loudly calls out without raising her hand. Each time the teacher gives her a look, a redirection, or occasionally calls on her. What's our antecedent? Well, that's teacher lecturing. We're not paying Martha a whole lot of attention at that time. What's the behavior? It's the calling out repeatedly, not raising her hand. And what is the consequence? What happens immediately afterwards? It's teacher attention. The teacher is giving a look, a redirection, and occasionally calling on her. So what do we think is the function of this behavior? Well, likely it's to get or obtain some form of attention based on the patterns that we're seeing right now. Armed with the pattern and the function of the behavior, we can use the ABCs to our advantage, adjusting what we put into the environment or take out of the environment to reduce the chance of that problem behavior happening. So when it comes to the antecedent of the behavior, what can we do to prevent the behavior? When it comes to the target behavior itself, what behavior do we want to teach and replace it with? This replacement behavior should help the student to get a little bit of what they want, such as that attention or escape, but in a more desirable way. And with regards to the consequences, We want to use the consequences like attention or escape to encourage the new appropriate behavior, like asking for a break. Let's see what we could do for Martha. So with regards to preventing, we could provide her attention ahead of a lecture and provide her with a lot of eye contact throughout the lecture just to make sure that she knows we're still connected. I still see you. As far as teaching, we can teach her how to raise her hand and when to raise her hand and prompt for that hand raising, maybe reminding her when she forgets. And when it comes to the consequences or how we respond to her behavior, we're not going to call on her when she's not raising her hand. We'll only call on her when she raises her hand. So we'll ignore her when she doesn't raise her hand and when she calls out. You'll notice that our examples so far have been at the individual student level. However, you can apply the logic to classrooms and small groups, like this chaotic classroom in the cartoon. Let's walk through an example. So here we have a sixth grade teacher who found that over 30% of the behavioral incident reports occurred as students were entering her classroom from the hallway. So what's happening before? Well, we've got too many students entering into the classroom all at once. They're socializing in the hallways and they're socializing as they're making their way through. What is the behavior? They're getting into physical contact, they're arguing with each other, and they're just coming in noisy. And as far as the consequence, what happens directly afterwards? They're getting attention from their peers. They're getting attention from the teacher. The teacher is spending a lot of time and energy redirecting. So what is our hypothesis? Our hypothesis around the function of the behavior? Well, that is that they are seeking attention. They're socializing, right? Okay, so how do we respond and think about the ABCs to respond? Well, to prevent it, we could greet students at the door to prompt appropriate behavior and to front load that social contact. What can we teach? We can teach students how to enter into the classroom and how to enter appropriately. And how do we respond to when they do the things that we want to do? We reinforce waiting, walking, and accurate use of traffic flow patterns. And we do that with social praise. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This entry routine is really working. Thank you so much, everybody. And we might provide them with some tangible praise, such as tickets or dojos or whatever acknowledgement system that you have in place. A helpful acronym to use with teachers in thinking about how to respond to behaviors is to be FAST. So we want to be functional. So we want to figure out and address the why of a behavior. We want to be accurate. So we want to follow our school's response protocols for that particular behavior, making sure that the response is appropriate to the level of severity of the behavior and the function of the behavior. We want to be specific, make sure to make it clear which students you're addressing and your perception of why the behavior is happening. And as teachers, we want to be timely, responding to the behavior as soon as possible to maximize the impact of our response. You can find a lot of this information in the supporting and responding to behavior document. So let's see how we could apply FAST to Myra's calling out behavior. So during class discussion, Myra consistently calls out responses rather than raising her hand. Her teacher quickly but briefly to Myra says, "Myra, we know that you have a lot to share. We would love to hear your thoughts, but please wait for me to call on you so everyone can have a turn to be heard." Then, when Myra does raise her hand, the teacher calls on her immediately. So we were functional in that the teacher identified that Myra had a lot to share. The teacher was accurate in that the teacher provided another opportunity to share and called on her when she had raised her hand. The teacher was specific in that she used Myra's name and addressed the reason for the behavior, such as being eager to share. And the teacher was timely. She responded immediately after the behavior occurred. This is where knowing your students' developmental level and individual students' responses are important. You may not want to address a student publicly in this way. For some, it may be better to do this more subtly on the side. So thinking about how you can use the function of behavior to support your classes and school as a whole, you can use your office discipline data to find patterns. This may require that you modify your forms and your system to include a place for function. Sometimes it's called motivation, as is in the case of Swiss. Once you've identified a pattern within a context, like the classroom, select strategies that address the why of that behavior. Those strategies should address the ABCs of the behavior, identifying means to prevent the undesirable behaviors from happening, teaching more desirable behaviors, and responding to behaviors so that the desirable ones become stronger and more frequent, and the undesirable ones become less frequent. If you find yourself addressing the same behavior for multiple students, you may want to consider applying your intervention to the class level, so to all the students within your class. Either on your own or when you're next with your team, take time to walk through this activity. First, break down the ABCs of a student whom you know well. What strategies could you use to prevent, teach, and respond to the student's behavior? Then think of patterns of behavior you see in classroom or non-classroom contexts, such as the hallways or in the cafeteria. Break down the ABCs and try to identify strategies to prevent, teach, and respond to the student behavior of a group of students. Please remember, it's often helpful to start with reteaching the expectations and making sure that staff are using your school acknowledgement systems. Always check your fidelity to your Tier 1 strategies first before adding more interventions.
So as educators, a major part of our role in addressing student behaviors and emotion is making sure that we are not promoting undesirable behaviors through our own actions. So with that said, it's easy to find ourselves in power struggles with students. We're going to spend a few moments talking about strategies you can use when you find yourself in a situation with an escalating student. So let's go through a quick scenario. As you listen to Eric and I read through this scenario, consider whether you or your peers have been in a similar situation. Okay, so I'm going to play Jason and Eric will play the role of the teacher.
Okay. Jason, please turn in your assignment.
What assignment?
The assignment you didn't finish during class?
I finished it.
Great. Please turn it in now.
I don't have it with me now.
You have a choice. Turn it in or do it again.
You never believe me.
I guess you've made the choice to do it again.
Make me.
That's disrespect. Go to the office.
F you.
I move closer and put my hand on Jason's shoulder.
And typically a student will pull away, glare, and sometimes even raise their fist to strike, or may have pushed your arm off, right? So have you ever seen this play out before, right? What could the teacher have done in this scenario differently to change that outcome? Right? So let's keep in mind some helpful assumptions before we move forward in thinking about how we could have responded to a situation like we just went through. So let's start out. Behavior is learned. It has a history, right? That particular behavior helps students get something that they want, right? It's that function thing again. Also, behavior is lawful. There is a pattern to our behavior. We tend to use the same behaviors again and again to get what we want, right? Again, it's the function. We can also assume that behavior is escalated through successive interactions. So like Jason, a student's behavior can escalate based on what's happening in the environment. And if we add something to the environment, like we're sarcastic or we give a punishment or our body language, clenched fist or something, we can end up triggering more escalated behaviors. Furthermore, the more times we engage in this back and forth, the more the behavior gets practiced and becomes fluent to the student and to the staff, right? And finally, and importantly, we know that behavior can be changed through teaching. We can teach students new ways of responding to their environment, just like we would teach math or writing. They keep doing the same behavior because that's the only skill they have. We need to teach them a new skill, right? Of course, we want to be mindful about when we teach that skill. So knowing how the brain works can really help us to identify the best time to teach a new skill or new behavior, and B, how to best intervene with a student as they're escalating in emotions and behaviors. So the more escalated we are in our emotions, the less capacity we have to think rationally and control our impulses. Same for students as it is for adults. So when a student is calm, that's when we as educators want to reinforce that they're showing the expected behaviors, right? They're following the expectations. We use our class-wide PBIS structures to help us establish and maintain that calm. So when students are calm, it's the best time to practice what students can do when they do find themselves frustrated or agitated, like taking deep breaths, counting to 10, going to a calming or reset corner, right? They're in a good state of mind to receive that information and retain it. So that's when we want to do our teaching. But we know the reality is that things in the student's environment, it could be a demand, something we've asked them to do, some kind of snicker from a peer, or even maybe a disapproving look from us. That might trigger a student to start to become agitated. You might see your student either shutting down, or you see an increase in behaviors like looking around, tapping a pencil with their feet, right? It's that beginning of agitation. So it's really important, if we notice a student at this stage, we want to intervene quickly while they still have that mental regulation to receive feedback from you. So it's a great time to check the environment to see, is there anything contributing to the student's agitation? We can check in with the student, right? Ask them how they're doing and what they need. We might suggest a coping skill, right? Let's take some deep breaths, right? And to gently remind them of their options. You can go to the reset corner. If you want to go get a drink, right? We're giving them their options. It's also important at this time to be in touch with our own reactions. So as we see a student become more agitated, it's really easy to take it personally or to let our emotions and behaviors escalate as well. So especially this happens, right, if we've had some challenging interactions with this student before, right? Remember we said behavior is escalated through successive interactions, right, on both sides, right? So again, this is a good time to use those neutralizing routines to calm ourselves so that we can maintain our calm in the situation and we can refrain from unnecessarily escalating the situation. Once the student has accelerated up towards the peak, right, they're no longer thinking clearly. The student is just reacting. And at that point, our focus needs to be on maintaining safety. So to highlight some strategies we could use when we find a student becoming escalated, right? We already said we want to start by intervening early, meaning we want to intervene before the undesirable or unexpected behavior happens, right? And that we do that by having really good class-wide systems and practices in place. But if we do notice a student starting to escalate, as evidenced by being off task or shutting down, we want to have strategies ready, like reminding them of the expectations, checking in, suggesting those alternative behaviors and options like we just went through. We also want to consider what's going on in the environment that might be contributing to the student's escalation. Like, is it really noisy? Is there a peer nearby that they don't get along with, right? Is our body language or tone of voice inadvertently escalating or agitating the student? And can we alter any of those things to help a student regain their calm? Right? As we become more familiar with a student's patterns of behavior, we can identify replacement behaviors that they might need, that we can teach them and give them a chance to practice when the student is calm, right? So if Jason typically engages with a teacher in this way and it seems like it's for attention, maybe we can teach and reinforce him with attention when he asks for help rather than sort of shutting down or becoming agitated. Finally, we want to make sure that we're not contributing to the student's escalation. So we want to have a neutralizing routine that we've practiced and we have it ready to implement when the students are engaging in an undesirable behavior or that behavior is escalating. So, for example, you have this two-step neutralizing routine, right? We see an unwanted behavior or the start of a power struggle. We stop and we ask ourselves, am I triggered right now? Or am I agitated, right? By this student, this situation, or maybe I was just having a bad day. I'm not feeling well. I haven't eaten. I need to go to the bathroom, whatever it is. Am I feeling triggered or agitated? And if the answer is, yeah, I kind of am, I go to our alternative response. So a quick example of one of those responses would be to delay, reframe, and take care. So I might delay any discipline actions until I'm calm, right? I don't just say, you're out of the room or you're getting detention, right? I reframe my student's behavior in my head and in a strength-based way, thinking like, okay, she's finding a way to communicate her needs to me. I need to hear what she's saying. And then taking care of myself, right? Making sure that that I'm breathing, that I'm calm, maybe I've eaten, I had some water before I address the situation, right? And like Kent McIntosh has said, it's when our students or the little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not to join in their chaos. So take a moment, consider the scenario of the teacher and Jason, and consider how the situation could have been avoided and how the teacher could have responded differently by intervening early, manipulating the environment, doing some pre-teaching of a replacement behavior, or utilizing the neutralizing routine or a fast routine. Okay. When you're next with your team, talk about the extent to which you see power struggles within your own school and do some action planning about professional development and coaching on this topic for later this year or next school year. So let's just quickly go back to Jason and the teacher. So how could the teacher make sure that situation doesn't continue to escalate? Well, first, the teacher can recognize that Jason is potentially engaging in another power struggle, right? And we can start using a neutralizing routine, like taking deep breaths, giving Jason choices, using a more calm voice, right? We might say, hey, you can go find your assignment. You can complete it by the end of the day. Or you know what, we can follow up later if we need to discuss this more or if you need some help, right? Thinking about our tone and the way we're giving that message. By doing that, the teacher is already intervening early, right? Ideally, well before this interaction, the teacher would have provided reminders to the class to have the assignment available to turn in. That would be a way to potentially prevent this interaction from happening in the first place. With regards to manipulating the environment, maybe the teacher takes a few steps back, maintains a neutral stance, right? I'm not crossing my arms or my arms are on my hips, have a tone of voice that's neutral to reduce any chance of coming across as threatening or challenging. And then let's presume that Jason's pattern of behavior suggests that he's doing these power struggles to get attention, right? The teacher could front load that attention for Jason by greeting him at the door, right? By providing a subtle reminder to make sure that he has all of his assignments with him and praising him when he either has his work with him or he takes that initiative to go and find the work. So these are just some potential strategies for preventing power struggles. So for most schools, we're in that home stretch. We only have a few months left to go in the school year. Yay! So this is a good time to think about how you can support your class-wide PBIS efforts and the efforts for your class next year. The supporting and responding to behavior document that we shared in November provides really wonderful, useful tools for organizing your class-wide supports. Right? It has all of the foundational systems you should have in place, and then has descriptions of evidence-based practices for behavior management. And each of these practices has a description of the feature with elementary and secondary examples for you to review. There's also some wonderful decision-making charts that can aid teachers in making decisions and your system in general about implementation of class-wide practices. It's a really useful document, very interactive. Highly recommend you get it and look through it and use it in your professional development. So we have 3 basic questions that your team will want to ask, right? Whether the foundations of effective PBIS classroom systems are in place, like having predictable routines in place and clear expectations, and both are explicitly taught to students. Another question is related to whether classroom preventative and responsive practices like active supervision of students, your acknowledgement system, and your error correction system, are they being used consistently throughout your building in your classrooms? And then finally, you'll want to ask whether there's data to indicate whether students are engaging in problem behaviors and what those problem behaviors are, what they look like with regards to frequency, duration, and function. In order to answer those questions, you may need to back up and see how you could answer those questions through data. So again, is your data system collecting things like function and behavior, or can you add that field so you start collecting that? You also might use walkthroughs of your building, looking at different classrooms, or surveys, and of course, that student behavioral data. The classroom practice self-assessment that's within that same document, the supporting and responding to behavior guide. It can be used with individual teachers, have them self-assess and implement core practices or work on practices that they feel weak in. But you can also provide it to groups of teachers or your whole staff, your whole faculty staff, to identify needs across your school in multiple classrooms. And then you can potentially target these areas for professional development and coaching of staff. So the truth is, changing the practices of adults, which is what we're doing here, it can be really hard and it definitely takes time. So we want to be realistic in what we're asking teachers to do. If they feel like we're just piling on, they'll be more resistant, right? We are asking them to create new habits and new behavioral patterns. So we need to give them time to learn them, practice them. So we want to set them up for success, right? We might need to add cues in the environment to remind them to engage in new behavior, maybe big signs that says 5 to 1, positive to negative, things that will remind them to give positive, right? We might engage in explicit practice with them to build fluency. So, how do we respond when we have an undesirable behavior? During a PD, you might want to do role plays, have teachers pair up or in groups of 3 and role play and actually verbally practice saying those things. And then we want to celebrate their successes. We want to give them lots of positive feedback when they do it. Wow, I noticed you've been working with Jason a lot better. You haven't called me to your room. Looks like he's doing better. Good job. You're using those strategies. Let them know, right? And for more information on how to build new habits of effective practices, check out that webinar and the practice brief on habits of effective classroom practice. It's really, really good. I really like that one. Okay, when you're with your team next, spend some time discussing classroom PBIS at your school in preparation for next year, right? How well are we into the classroom? Review what practices are currently in place in your school and which ones you might want to add. Right? It could be helpful if you think about what trainings your teachers have had in recent years in regards to supporting students' behavior and what practices seem to have taken hold. And again, which one do we need to maybe practice again and reinforce? When you think about how teachers might respond to the content, right? Are they going to be receptive? Are they going to be a little standoffish, right? You have to think about that and about how we're going to provide it and how we're going to blend it into their PD. What are they going to need to feel confident in implementing these recommendations and practicing? And how can your team use data to assess how well they're implementing them, or do they need more coaching, right? By identifying who needs support, then we can coach in their classroom or provide more practice. And then, of course, we always want to provide positive and constructive feedback. We don't want them to feel like they're being evaluated, rather that they're being coached and supported. So thank you for spending time to view this video and the content and work with your team. In April, teams will be reviewing some assessment tools such as staff self-assessments and climate surveys, and we'll be reviewing the tiered fidelity inventory and the related companion guides that go along with that. And teams will be action planning, completing their team implementation checklists, and scheduling their TFIs. So thanks again, and we will see you next month. Take care.
Thank you.